Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Remembering Robert E. Lee program for 2010. Precisely 140 years ago tomorrow, at approximately 9:15 a.m. in the President's House on this campus, Robert E. Lee passed from his earthly life and into the annals of history. Lee had served 5 very challenging years as the president of Washington College from the fall of 1865 until the fall of 1870 at his death. It is those 5 years of service that we remember here today. And for those of us connected with this institution, it is his work here at Washington and Lee University and its students that comprise Lee's living legacy. Today, we are pleased to have with us William C. Davis, who serves as the Director of Programming at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. A graduate of Sonoma State University in California, he is an award-winning author of more than 40 books on the American Civil War and Southern history. In 1993, his alma mater recognized him with their Distinguished Alumnus Award. The Lee Chapel staff earlier this morning had the pleasure of spending an hour with Dr. Davis and learning more about how he came to make Civil War and Southern history his life's work. Over his career, Davis has not only authored, but he has also served as editor, consultant, and contributor to countless articles, books, films, and publications. He has served as the film productions such as The Blue and the Gray, Gettysburg, The Final Fury, ABC television series about the Civil War that some of you may recall, North and South. He has also assisted the BBC, the History Channel, and Greystone Communications in a number of their projects. Recently, in conjunction with his colleague, Dr. James I. Robertson, Jr. of Virginia Tech, he wrote and narrated the WPRA public television series, Virginia at War. This series was just completed in 2009. Some of his other writings include The Lost Cause, Civil War Photographers, A Taste for War, The Culinary History of the Blue and the Gray, and 2 book series, Images of War and the Civil War Library. He is accompanied today to Lexington by his wife Sandra and their house guest from England, Mr. Tony Hall. Today's topic, Robert E. Lee, the Man in the Middle, will discuss the year of 1860 and the run-up to the American Civil War. Please join me in welcoming to Washington and Lee University and to the Lee Chapel stage, William C. Davis.
Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's delightful to see the chapel so full of people who are as yet so awake. We'll try our best to keep it that way. Linda mentioned that we do have a guest here from England, Tony Hall, who was once my editor on some of the books I did, because believe it or not, the Civil War is a very popular topic in England as well as here. Linda mentioned work for the BBC. I did a few things for him, but what will be most memorable is an interview I did for BBC Radio while I was living over there. And it was clear that the interviewer had not really prepped himself very well on who this guy was that someone else had sent to speak to him. So he introduced himself, I introduced myself. He then said, well, tell me about this book you have written. And I said, well, this book is about the Civil War. And he said, the Civil War, that's when you all won your independence from us, isn't it? And I said, no, as a matter of fact, it's not. it was the war between the North and the South. And he said, oh, I had no idea that North America and South America ever fought a war. and that was the high point of the interview. So it's very kind of you all to come. I should point out as well, I'm delighted to see my pharmacist from Blacksburg out here in the crowd. There's Katie someplace. It's always handy to travel with somebody in the medical profession in case people react badly to what I say. I'm hoping she has a pharmacopoeia with her. As Linda said, I do come from Virginia Tech. It's a wonderful place. I just love it there. But I confess to feeling a bit of envy for Washington and Lee, or of Washington and Lee, because your name up here says what you are. The first name of the first great Virginian, the second name that of the next greatest Virginian. Your name speaks of your history, your heritage. For anyone who knows about Robert E. Lee's commitment to education, it speaks about your commitment to education. Our name at Virginia Tech sends some mixed messages, I think. You hear, it is in fact Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, which is quite a mouthful to say after 2 beers. So it's been shortened to Virginia Tech. To most people, this conjures an image of the technical arts, and indeed Virginia Tech's architecture and engineering and other schools are among the finest in the nation. But the fact remains that the overwhelming majority of the faculty and staff are part of the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. The other thing that Virginia Tech is known for, of course, is that 8 or 9 times every fall, 22 genetically altered giants run around a lovely green field for 3 hours chasing a ball that doesn't roll. This is very new to me. As Linda mentioned, I went to Sonoma State University in Northern California. This was in the late 60s, and I'm living proof that there are people who grew up there and lived through that era who do remember most of it. We had no, the late wonderful British comedian Robert Morley once maintained that all human misery, all conflict, all war throughout human history is the result of someone inventing the ball. Because then people choose up sides and fight over the ball. Had there been no ball, there would be no war. I guess the founders of my small school took that to heart because we had no intercollegiate sports that involved a ball. We had no football, no basketball, no baseball, no tennis, no field hockey. We didn't even have golf because a small ball can lead to a big ball, which can lead to war. We had one intercollegiate sport, believe it or not, I was on the team, and that was fencing. So think about it. This school that's peace and love and brotherhood for everyone has one intercollegiate sport in which the goal is to replicate maiming or killing someone. Consequently, when I hear stories about statements by Lee and others that I'm going to take the sword, I think they're just going out for collegiate athletics. If Lee had ever said, picked up a football and said to Jefferson Davis, "Send me in, coach," then I would know he meant war. Lee, of course, did talk a great deal in 1860, and then in 1861 about that issue, and in those terms of drawing his sword or sheathing it. You all know the scene, I'm sure. You've read the story. On March 28, 1861, Lee received and accepted promotion as Colonel of the 1st United States Cavalry, a commission that was signed by the new President, Abraham Lincoln. By that time, Lee had already received an overture from Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker in Montgomery, Alabama, representing the new Confederacy, offering him a commission as a brigadier general in their new army. So far as we know, Lee never responded to Walker, which would be entirely proper for a serving United States Army officer. And Lee owed no allegiance to Walker or the new Confederate government. Lee had, at that moment, only 2 loyalties: the United States and Virginia. so it was easy to ignore approaches from Montgomery without any strains on his conscience. But then those two loyalties collided. The firing on Fort Sumter on April 14, 1861, led to Lincoln's call the next day for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called the rebellion. On April 17, even as the Virginia State Convention went into secret session one more time to debate seceding, Lee received a summons from General Winfield Scott in Washington, and also a request for a meeting with Francis Preston Blair. The next day, Lee met first with Blair, who informed him that Lincoln had authorized Blair to offer Lee command of the new 75,000-man army to be raised to put down the insurrection. And with that command would go the 2 stars of a major general. After more than 30 years in the Army, Lee had gained only 4 promotions, thanks to the glacial pace of promotion in the old Army. Now he faced the possibility of jumping 3 grades in rank in just 3 weeks to the very pinnacle of his profession. And yet, as you all know, Lee politely but firmly declined, asserting his opposition to secession, along with his even greater unwillingness to participate in what would have to be an invasion of the South, and in particular of Virginia. When he went to his interview with Scott and informed him of what he had told Blair, Scott was not surprised, but when Lee said he still hoped to stay in the Army so long as Virginia did not secede, Scott told him that any officer unwilling to be actively employed in any assignment handed to him must resign his commission, and that in the circumstances, Lee should do so. Lee met with other people to discuss this issue during that day and evening as he tried to see his way through the sudden chaos. The next morning, April 19th, he went into Alexandria and had decision forced upon him when he learned that Virginia's convention had voted to secede. It was the talk on all lips. And when Lee stopped in a pharmacy to pay his bill, he heard yet more fulminating on leaving the Union, and he sadly told the apothecary, "I am one of those dull creatures that cannot see the good of secession." That was surely the worst night of his life to date. He sat up, so we're told, and I'm sure it's true, and pondered and struggled with a host of conflicting emotions before, sometime after midnight, he wrote the single-sentence letter to the government in which he resigned his commission in a stroke, ending the career that had occupied all of his adult life. He enclosed with it a heartfelt letter to Scott saying he would have resigned immediately during their last meeting, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from a service to which I have devoted all the best years of my life. He hoped now, he said, never to don uniform or take arms again, save in defense of my native state. It was, said Lee's biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman, the answer he was born to make. Freeman's oft-repeated quotation makes Lee's moment of truth sound virtually as preordained as Christ's moment of sacrifice. But Lee's was also an answer molded by his family, his blood, his family history, his years in the military, by the public affairs that swirled around him, and by the nature of his individual personality and character, which no amount of blood can predetermine. He had been virtually a man in the middle, trapped between conflicting emotions and contesting loyalties. By the way, this juxtaposition of references to Lee with Jesus in the same sentence is not accidental. A man named Marcus Hinton, an Englishman, a toy soldier modeler who also dressed in frock coats and bowler hats, and was the founder as well as the self-appointed Major General commanding what he styled the United Kingdom branch of the Confederate High Command, wrote a letter to members of his organization in Nashville, Tennessee, at Christmas 1964. Parenthetically, I should note that this is not the same Marcus Hinton who was recently a tight end for the Oakland Raiders and the New Orleans Saints. A black man from Mississippi who, so far as I'm aware, has shown no interest in being a major general in any Confederate organization. Have you ever wondered, asked Hinton, if there was ever any other being born on earth after Christ that may have had a similar message. General Robert E. Lee, Hinton continued, was a man of deity, forgiveness, and probity. A careful study of General Lee and the many great and noble deeds he performed would present all men with a pattern of life that God and His Son would smile upon. He is the patron saint of the Confederate High Command, said Hinton, that great General, Robert E. Lee, our Commander-in-Chief, the Lord in heaven. So there you have it. Lee is the only human being in almost 20 centuries who is a match for Jesus. And in fact, at least as of Christmas 1864 in Tadlow, England, he had been canonized as a saint and apparently had displaced Christ's Father as the Lord in heaven. Now, this being Lexington, Virginia, of course, I take it for granted that none of you will disagree with that. We actually know rather little about Lee's political views. Rather, he seems strangely muffled, saying virtually nothing publicly and very little even to friends or family to give us some clues as to where he stood in the maelstrom of controversy going on from the 1830s up to 1860. We have no certain knowledge of any political party identification, and we have no evidence as to how he voted prior to the war or even if he voted. While Lee was eligible to vote in 8 presidential elections from 1832 to 1860, it's almost certain that he didn't vote in 8 of them, and quite probable that he didn't vote in the other 2. In his time, voting by people in the active military was the exception, not the rule. Absentee balloting was not an option in that era, nor did soldiers begin voting in the field until 1864. A man had to vote in his home county, which meant that men in uniform on distant postings had no opportunity to exercise the franchise. The only elections for which he was in or within easy reach of his home county were 1836, when he was working in Washington, D.C., and 1848, when he was briefly home between assignments. Now, officers in the professional army, then as now, were not immune to politics. They acted under the same influences of family, friends, regional origin, popular fears and excitements that motivate all of us. But they lived in a rather different environment from other citizens. The pre-war officer corps was, and to some degree still is, an enclave, not unlike the faculty and administration of a college or university. I have lived in both enclaves in my life, and I can testify, at least from my observation, that they can be a bit detached from what most of us would regard as the real world. I'm sure this doesn't apply to W&L Holt, so no worries. They not only work together, they live together. Their friendships are almost exclusively formed among their peers. The degree of intermarriage among their families, I believe, far exceeds that of any other profession, at least of which I know. A very definite culture develops, not only in the profession at large, but also within its individual component parts, whether it be an army post or a particular campus. And there's a tendency for people in both to view outside events chiefly through the lens of those events' impact upon their professions. Each feels underappreciated, frustrated at slow career advancement, and historically operate under some degree of siege mentality in the face of a perceived underfunding and lack of public appreciation and respect. Lee will express those feelings privately on occasion, which just put him in the mainstream of the old Army Corps, officer corps, which in his time numbered fewer than 1,000 men. Lee felt the precarious position of the professional military. In that era, this may be hard for us to believe now, in that era, much of the public resented the cost of maintaining a standing professional army. Many politicians, particularly in the South, objected to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which provided education at public expense. The War Department represented overwhelmingly the lion's share of the federal budget every year, even during peacetime. And to many, the Army seemed a costly extravagance, providing employment for officers who were the sons of the privileged, and enlisted ranks who were scoured from the dregs of saloons and immigrant ships. There's no question that Lee, like all others, resented the public and press criticism of West Point as expensive and elitist. He wouldn't have been human had he not. Nor is there any doubt, I think, that he shared to some degree in the feeling of being elite that was prevalent among the officer class. Their professional experience, their absence from home, long absences from home for years sometimes, slow promotion, low pay, and frequent isolation on distant frontier posts made them band together. Naturally, they took mutual comfort from each other, leading to a certain insularity of outlook that, combined with their isolation and their sense of underappreciation, to breed a disdain for politics and for the presumably excitable and fickle masses who decided elections by the 1850s. Feeling themselves vulnerable to public whim, officers learned to keep their mouths shut outside the confines of their quarters and their posts. While the barracks and the officers' mess may have reverberated with debate and heated discussion on issues of the day, echoes of those discussions seldom extended beyond fortress walls or picket line. It was simply good sense and self-preservation to keep their views to themselves rather than risk offending anyone with influence. And nothing has changed about that. You have only to look back to the events at the beginning of this summer to see what happens when an officer unwisely speaks out. Consequently, Lee is not at all exceptional in the almost complete absence of any public statements from him on political matters prior to the war. What separates him from most of the others, however, is that he carried that reticence over even into his personal correspondence, or at least what survives. Other than a few comments on secession and slavery, he's almost mute on the major issues like expansionism, tariffs, internal improvements, and above all, the issue of the extension of slavery into the territories which will be the catalyst for the cataclysm to come. We can, however, interpolate a reasonable guess as to what Lee's basic political ideology might have been. According to his cousin, Cassius Lee, at some unspecified time in the 1840s or early 1850s, Robert E. Lee told him that he regarded the Whig Party's principles as being superior to those of the Democrats. If he said that, we don't have this in Lee's own words, this is secondhand. If he said that, then even if Lee did not personally think of himself as a Whig, still he looked more favorably on their policies than on those of their opponents. And that would be entirely consistent with his family background and his own personal experience. His father, Revolutionary War hero General Henry Lee, was a Federalist in the years after independence. The Federalists stood for strong central government, a national bank, protective tariffs, and the judicious expenditure of Treasury funds on public projects to promote enterprise and commerce. They were also in large part representatives of upper-class families like the Lees, and were bitterly opposed by Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, which of course eclipsed them after 1800. In fact, Lee's father, Henry Lee, was attacked and beaten by a Republican mob in 1812 and died 6 years later, largely as a result of his injuries. That fact alone might have influenced his son to embrace his father's politics and reject those of the people who had virtually killed him. By the time Lee left West Point in 1829, the Federalists were dead and Jefferson's party had split into a new alignment of conservative elements coalesced into Andrew Jackson's new Democratic Party, while the more liberal wing of Whigs joined with most of the old Federalists to create what became the Whig Party. As he commenced his professional career and manhood in the 1830s, Lee witnessed a public debate marked by the Whigs' advocacy of Henry Clay's American system, promoting industrial and economic growth through a national bank, internal improvements, roads and canals, the creation of public schools and colleges, and modernization in general, all of which best suited Northern interests. By contrast, the Jacksonian Democrats advocated keeping America largely an agrarian society and culture, and keeping government small and local, which at that time best represented Southern interests. Now, despite the fact that Lee, as a Virginian, naturally considered himself a Southerner, it's not hard to see why he identified more with the Whigs. First, they're the party of his father and many of his family, as well as of many of the first families of Virginia. Throughout his life, Lee's correspondence revealed a definite sense that his class, the old landed families, had a special place and a special mission to lead. It would be going way too far to say that Lee looked down on or disdained the common people, but there's no question that he felt himself and his class to be somewhat different from them, and that he did not entirely trust their wisdom or intellect, and even to some degree their morals. By extending the vote to uneducated and unpropertied commoners, masses of them recent immigrants, Jackson's Democrats risked handing government over to a rabble, or that's how the Whigs saw it. In 1839, when he was serving in St. Louis, Lee commented that, and I quote, "The lower class are a swaggering, noisy set." And he observed that even the local economic elite in Missouri were still new money. There were no old families of landed aristocrats with a tradition of leadership. Instead, men were obsessed with business and with making money, while their children, he said, were demanding and dirty. So at least children have remained the same between then and today. They were not like his Virginians. Professionally, of course, Lee's best interests lay with the Whigs. After all, those internal improvements they wanted to fund, the roads and canals and the bridges, would largely be constructed by his branch of the service, the Army Corps of Engineers, which meant that while the Democrats largely resented the professional army that employed him, the Whigs were anxious to keep him employed, building their public projects. In short, the Whigs buttered Lee's side of the bread. In the shifting and increasingly confused maelstrom of American politics, the 1840s brought some interesting nuances to Lee's Whig tendencies. When the Democratic president, James Polk, commenced war with Mexico in 1846, Lee, like the Whigs, doubted the justice of the cause. But as a serving officer, he still, of course, where his government sent him. He might disagree with the war, but he knew that it was a soldier's duty to implement government policy and not to try to influence it. Of course, the war made Lee professionally, made him a national hero, and brought him into the intimate circle of General Winfield Scott, who would become almost a second father to him. And after the war, when another war hero, Zachary Taylor, runs for the presidency as a Whig, Lee will actually be one of the organizational members planning an inaugural ball for Taylor. Now, we don't know if he was appointed to this because of Lee's own Whig tendencies or if it's because Lee was also a war hero, but nevertheless, he was associating with a lot of Whigs at that same time. 4 years later, when Winfield Scott was the Whig nominee, Lee couldn't have voted for him from his post in New York, but it seems to me inconceivable that he did not favor Scott for the presidency. In fact, from early manhood, Lee seems not to have had a very high opinion of politicians in general, and he most definitely believed that military men had no business dabbling in politics. In 1843, when he's serving at St. Louis, a fellow officer, while still a serving officer, ran for a public office in the city. Lee chided him that to become a political partisan would be derogatory to your office and profession, which I hope you will never descend to. In your attending to your duties in all professional matters, your opinions and acts should be grounded by your judgment and not with a benefit to this or that party. Revealing his clear conviction that military officers should not speak out on public issues, he told that friend, it would not be proper for you to make use of your office to influence the vote of any man or to support or advance any party. It's no surprise then, I think, that Lee stayed quiet among friends, associates, and the civilian community at large on significant public issues. Even after he became the most popular man in the Confederacy and arguably the most influential, he still would not lend the prestige of his name to any side on any public question. Typical of his class, he clung to tradition and the status quo, largely as a means of preserving order and harmony. There lay one of his reasons for distrusting the cry of the masses, and more than once his disdain for some common voters, especially the foreign-born, and these sentiments begin to creep into his correspondence, as he views them as a clamorous mob who disturbed the peace and were cynically manipulated by scheming politicians. Were it not for those two self-serving entities, in his view, the passage of time might have settled amicably the differences between North and South. Rather, as Abraham Lincoln viewed his own course in the first years of the war to come, Lee was content to allow himself to be propelled by events rather than seek to influence them. A patrician by nature, he expected that the lower classes ought to defer because to those who had the intellect, ability, and the hereditary tradition of leadership necessary to do what was right for all. And this is not necessarily an elitist viewpoint. This is very widespread and common, North and South alike. But of course, that's no longer the way American politics worked. We good Democrats do strange things sometimes, he wrote in 1843, meaning not Democrats with a capital D, but rather the entire voting population practicing democracy. And in a thinly veiled reference to the means by which politicians could appeal to the masses, to manipulate them for their ends, he added in a rare display of sarcasm that any officer who entered politics would have no choice but to, quote, throw up your hat with the highest and hurrah with the loudest. In short, you must make yourself one with the noisy mob if you hope to get elected. Lee's opinion of soldiers mixing in politics didn't soften with the passing years. Jumping ahead to the Civil War, in 1862, he commented, "I think the military and civil talents are distinct, if not different, and full duty in either sphere is about as much as one man can qualify himself to perform." Beside that, his opinion of the men who sought and held public office only worsened. Politicians, he said in 1863, are more or less so warped by party feeling, by selfishness or prejudices, that their minds are not altogether balanced. They are the most difficult to cure of all insane people. Politics having so much excitement in them. If you've been watching TV lately, you know it hasn't changed. Perhaps it was easier for Lee to dismiss politicians as a class and politics itself because he seems to have devoted little, if any, effort to studying or understanding the men and issues hurtling the nation toward the brink. On those few occasions when he did leave behind an opinion on a public issue, he revealed at times an unsophisticated view and sometimes an almost simplistic take on what was happening around him. To him, slavery had nothing to do with driving a wedge between North and South. Rather, it was the argument over slavery practiced by cynical popular leaders on both sides that fomented the crisis. Lee recognized that slavery was not a good thing. However, given the assumption on his part, and again, he's part of the mainstream of his culture then, given the assumption of the mental and moral inferiority of Africans, he saw slavery as a good means of elevating that race while at the same time preserving a social order in which white and black could peacefully occupy the same continent until the Almighty, not man, ultimately decided the Negro's place in America. Nothing survives to suggest that Lee ever even considered or was aware of broader issues such as what we would call human rights, or the adverse impact of slavery on the Union's standing and prestige in a Western culture that by 1860 had universally rejected human bondage more than a generation before. The inherent contradiction of a society founded on expressions of liberty and equality engaging in human traffic seemed not to have perturbed him. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, after all, were framed by upper and upper middle class men for a polity they were to govern, and which Lee believed they were best suited still to govern. Maybe the most telling example of his lack of engagement with the politics of his time came in an interview, in fact, he gave here in Lexington in 1868, when he commented that before the war, Jefferson Davis, soon to be president of the Confederacy, had been, I quote, "of course, one of the extremist politicians," unquote. Only Yankees or Southerners quite unaware of what was said and done in Washington in the 1850s could accuse Davis of being an extremist. In fact, he had been one of the more moderate Southern leaders, slow to embrace even the threat of secession, and even then sincerely anxious to find some means of compromise between the sections short of separation. To some degree, like Lee himself, Davis was a conditional unionist for whom secession was always a last resort and never a desirable end in itself. The real extremists, the so-called fire eaters who actively sought secession, distrusted Jefferson Davis from the moment he became president of the Confederacy. And in a system that was supposed to have only one party government, a second party did arise. It's simply the anti-Jefferson Davis party, populated entirely by these same extremists. They and Davis had nothing whatever in common. And that alone should have told Lee that Davis was cut from different cloth. But then virtually all of them, both Davis and the real secessionists, were not Lee's kind of people, with only a couple of exceptions. And certainly they were not Virginians. Davis had been at West Point, but Lee didn't know him well there. And when Davis was there, Lee's a model student, while Davis was a rebellious student who got kicked out of West Point twice. Davis had been a commander of volunteers in the war with Mexico, and at that time, Lee, like most professional officers, felt some degree of distrust of volunteer soldiers. They were not reliable, they thought. At the time that Lee's grandfather had been a wealthy tobacco planter in Tidewater, Virginia, and a civic leader in the House of Burgesses during the Revolution, Davis's grandfather was a poor, scarcely visible, itinerant farmer wandering from Pennsylvania to South Carolina to Georgia. No wonder it was easy for Lee to lump Davis in with those other nouveau riche Southern Democratic demagogues and the masses they agitated for their own ends. As intimately as Lee worked with Davis during the Civil War, and it was truly almost a model civil-military relationship, in later years still Lee would remain strangely muffled in expressing any opinion of Davis. By 1865, the Confederate president regarded Lee as a close friend, yet there is no evidence that survives of what Lee felt internally, personally, about Jefferson Davis. Now, lest I give you the wrong impression, Lee was not a snob. He carried himself with dignity and with reserve as befit a man of his blood. He showed respect and courtesy to all. But it was a demeanor founded, I think, more on his confirmed belief in noblesse oblige than on notions of complete social equality. Lee would never have insulted or mistreated a poor, illiterate farmer or a common laborer, any more than as during the war years he would have mistreated a common soldier. Yet he also felt uneasy about such men voting and determining the course of the Union. He was an old-fashioned, high Federalist Whig, almost through and through. Or almost. There is no question, and he did speak out on this, that he had no use for secession. In 1857, he told his family that I know no other country, no other government than the United States and their Constitution. But then in 1860, when the Democratic Party split, virtually ensuring victory for the Republican nominee, Lincoln, Lee did the seemingly improbable. Being resolved that slavery was an acceptable, perhaps even a necessary evil that brought much good with it, He supported the right of slaveholders to take their property with them into the new territories to the west, the issue that will power the political debate, destroy the Whig Party, and eventually lead to the breakup of the Union. When the Democratic Party split, when the Republican Party in 1860, of course, adopts opposition to the spread of slavery as the main plank in its platform. So even though the Republicans represent much of the old Whig membership, there's no place in the Republican Party or its ideology for Lee. He has only two alternatives in the 1860 election. One was John Bell's Constitutional Union Party, a hodgepodge of old Whigs and others who thought the best thing to do was to take no stand on anything. And if you asked them the sun was shining, they would decline to make a comment or risk an opinion, simply asserting that everybody should remain true to the Constitution without explaining how that's going to avert a crisis. The other option was that same Democratic Party that Lee had so often dismissed as a populist, mob-driven machine. And then, as I said, in 1860, the Democrats split over the issue of extension of the slavery to the territories. One faction will nominate Stephen Douglas, representing mostly northern viewpoints and interests on the issue. The other faction will nominate John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, representing mostly southern viewpoints on the issue. It takes too long to get into the crucial differences between their platforms, but essentially the Democrats were not going to be able to get back together on this. Lee sided with Breckinridge. Now, Breckinridge himself, interestingly, is a man like Lee, a man in the middle, a conditional unionist. He didn't want his nomination, but he accepted it, being persuaded that if he accepted the nomination of his wing of the party, that would force Stephen Douglas to withdraw his nomination from the other wing. They could both resign together, and a single candidate who could be found who would unite the party again. That was certainly Lee's hope. But of course it wasn't going to happen because Stephen Douglas had spent 20 years trying to get a presidential nomination, and now that he finally had one, he wasn't going to give it up. The irony, however, is that because of his ideological views on taking slavery into the territories, Lee found himself now aligned, at least in his mind, with the southern branch of the party, the Breckinridge wing of the party, which included all the very hotheads and demagogues he had so long despised. He never expected Douglas would quit the race because, as he put it, politicians are too selfish to be martyrs. When the southern states called conventions to consider secession after the election of Lee wrote on December 14, 1860, the week before South Carolina's convention was to meet, "I am not pleased with the course of the Cotton States. Secession," he said, "is nothing but revolution." Speaking to his son, Rooney Lee, 6 weeks later, after Louisiana had become the 6th state to secede, he said, "In the early days of the Republic, secession was treason. What can it be now?" He would soon find out. And now commenced that tragic season of decision in which Lee found himself, a man in the middle, forced to confront and balance his loves and his loyalties, his patriotism and his sense of where he fit into a union that was no longer what he fondly remembered from his youth. Already on December 3rd, 1860, confronting the virtual certainty that South Carolina was going to secede and that in all probability more states would follow, Lee wrote, "I prize the Union very highly and know of no personal sacrifice that I would not make to preserve it, save that of honor." Through more than 30 years of military experience, military service to his country, through administrations he had liked and some he deplored, one fixed point in Lee's ever-changing universe was his unwavering loyalty to the Union. But now, and apparently for the first time, he placed a condition on that loyalty: save that of honor. He didn't precisely say what there was relating to his honor that might cause the exception, but that was coming. On January 16th, 1861, 3 months before he ultimately resigned, Lee wrote to his cousin, Annette Carter, that if the Union is dissolved, I shall return to Virginia and share the fortune of my people. At that point, of course, the Union was dissolved. 4 states had already seceded. Georgia was on the verge of doing so, and conventions in Louisiana and Texas were set to follow suit. So it's something more than just the secession of several states that constituted, in Lee's mind, a dissolution of the Union. But he didn't say what, nor did he say in what capacity he would return to Virginia, though the only inference is that he would no longer be a soldier. A week later, with Georgia seceded, he cleared the matter when he wrote to another cousin that if a disruption takes place, I shall go back in sorrow to my people and share the misery of my native state. Just why Virginia should be miserable because other states seceded, he didn't say. But the only meaning that fits is the contingency that Virginia herself might secede. That was the dissolution Lee had in mind. His Union was broken up when and if Virginia seceded. Only that could sever his allegiance to the United States. He went on to remove any doubt as to what his course would be when he added that, save in her defense, her being Virginia, there will be one soldier less in the world than there is now. That was clear enough. If Virginia seceded, Lee intended to resign his commission and be that one soldier less, unless he had to take arms to defend his state. If there were any remaining doubt as to what Lee intended to do, on January 29th, he wrote to his son Rooney that, save in Virginia's defense, I shall draw my sword no more. There's that drawing his sword. He's going to go play college athletics now. There, finally and unequivocally, Lee at the end of January confirmed that he had made the decision that he's supposed to have anguished over 10 weeks later. If Virginia seceded and the Union attempted by force of invasion to keep her in the Union, he would fight against the men who were now his comrades in arms and against the flag he had served so nobly all of his adult life. All that was needed to precipitate his action was Virginia's secession. And unless and until that happened, he would remain in the middle, in the Army, hoping for some miraculous accommodation that might spare the Union, Virginia, and his career in a service that he loved. Yet he sat passively by and watched events unfold, his actual engagement in the public crisis limited to some wishful thinking and his trust in his God. On February 23, 1861, with 7 states now out of the Union and a new Confederate government formed in Montgomery, Alabama, Lee said, I must try and be patient and await the end, for I can do nothing to hasten or retard it. It was all beyond his control or even his involvement. Were he a civilian, then as a scion of one of the great families of Virginia, he could have spoken out, were he not restrained by his uniform and his very proper concept of the limitations that it placed upon him. Lee was like hundreds of thousands of men in the middle, torn between their genuine love of and loyalty to the Union, and their suspicion or even dislike for the extremists on both sides, whom they saw promoting a crisis for their own ends, and their heartfelt allegiance to the places of their nativity, the friends, the family, the extended cords of loyalty to peoples of their home states. He, like they, fervently hoped that somehow a middle course might prevail, though it had no policy or program, nor any cogent plan, other than the prayer that if people just waited for passions to cool, then somehow some unforeseen compromise might yet avert disaster. But privately, the Lee who so often averred that secession was illegal had decided to acquiesce in it if he had no choice, and to raise his sword against the Union rather than see that Union maintained at the point of a bayonet. As late as April 25th, after Virginia had seceded and Lee had resigned his commission to accept command of Virginia's state forces, he still hoped somehow for compromise so long as actual fighting did not break out. There's a considerable number of leaders in the South who have this same hope. As long as we don't start shooting, we can still talk. A few days earlier, when his course was not yet known, the editor of the Alexandria Gazette declared that in this crisis, Lee's reputation, his acknowledged ability, his chivalric character, his probity, honor, and may we add to his eternal praise, his Christian life and conduct, make his very name a tower of strength. Yet when it was suggested that Lee lend that name and that influence to act as an arbiter now in the crisis, he declined. The fatalism that apparently dominated him throughout the sectional controversy, wedded to his abiding conviction that there was nothing he could do, left him believing there was no point in making the effort. It seems a strangely passive stance for a man who would soon demonstrate how dynamically he could act on the battlefield and how he could indeed influence political events far beyond the sound of his guns. But then Lee felt at home in uniform, not at the lectern or in the legislative hall. In his view now, he, like everyone else, like all the men in the middle, was a victim of history and the inscrutable workings of the Almighty. To paraphrase Freeman, Lee was born to abide by the decision his God made for him. Thank you all for listening.